All right. Hello there, Robert.
How are you?
I'm doing okay.
Well,
So,
whereabouts are you? I know you were out on the sort of doing the campaign trail kind of thing, talking to folks. Where are you now?
yeah, I live in Jersey City. That's my full-time residence, but I've been traveling a lot this year.
Hmm.
I, as you may know, did a nationwide tour of the post-riot areas
Hmm.
over the summer for about 2 months. And for a little less than a month, I was out in primarily Pennsylvania and Georgia. And
Where'd you go? I was tracking you when you were in Pennsylvania. I don't think I caught the shows from Georgia. Where'd you go, in Georgia?
In Georgia, I mainly was in the Atlanta area, the suburbs, the city itself. Um, that's where I spent the day of the election, and then maybe 4 or 5 days afterwards, you could go and observe actually some of the vote tabulation activities in places like the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, where that had been carried out. So yeah, that was mainly where I was. I was in Augusta for a day, but mostly it was in the Atlanta area. That seemed to me the most fruitful place to spend my time, just to sort of gauge any kind of election related trends.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, it was definitely an interesting election, probably
Yeah,
unprecedented election in the sense of countervailing trends in different places depending on where you were geographically.
yeah, and with the qualifier not gotten to yet that we're going to discuss, based on the data, uh, the estimates range from this being the highest turnout election since either 1908 or 1900. So I think if that is, assuming that to be the case, that would, I think, expectedly bring about some potentially countervailing trends, or some trends that aren't uniform across every geographic region. So yeah, there's a lot to dig through, which is why I think it almost feels like we're still in an election day scenario in a way. Um, okay, so let me just give some insight into what the impetus for this is. If you are on social media nowadays, particularly Twitter, but also YouTube, which are my primary two venues, Twitter being the most paramount one for me anyway, is that you get inundated with people, even if I just make a basic observation as to election related data. I'm inundated with people who don't accept the premise that any of the data is legitimate. They think that the entire election was fraudulent. Donald Trump has been saying that. And so it kind of erects a bit of an epistemological barrier as to what is open for discussion if you're simply unwilling to accept the veracity of anything stemming from like a random Secretary of State website as to what the outcome of the election the election was. Now there will be people on the left or liberals or Democrats who are saying, "Oh, you shouldn't even platform, quote unquote, anybody who would make an argument along the lines of assertion of fraud." But because that gives it validity, or that legitimizes it. And my posture on that is, I think we've reached a point where huge portions of the population are going to have long-standing doubts as to the legitimacy of this election. So just ignoring that and pretending like it doesn't exist is foolish. I engaged all the way through, as you know, with people who claimed that the 2016 election was illegitimate in some form or another, whether they claimed that the election was hacked, whether they claimed that foreign interference dictated the outcome in this or that state. The central claim as to the 2016 election was always sort of nebulous, so you can't really attribute it to any one core allegation most of the time. But nonetheless, I mean, that was always my posture then, and it is now. I'm not drawing an equivalence necessarily between the two. I'm just kind of giving insight as to what my attitude is. And so the proposition I put forward on Wednesday was the following. and I'll just read it out loud for clarity. It was that if anybody feels that they can make a rational case that the election was, quote, the outcome of the election was determined by elaborate systematic fraud, I invited that discussion, and you agreed with that contention, or at least you said that you can make an argument to that effect. So is that your contention?
Well, I would say that that argument can be made. I mean, my view is we've spent about the better part of the last 20 years coming up with procedures and protocols post 2000 by both the United States Election Assistance Commission, by the Election Integrity Project, by bipartisan blue ribbon committees, by people from both the right and the left, though a lot of this originated actually on the left after 2000 and particularly 2004 in Ohio in terms of the voting machine issue. Let's have transparent procedures so we can gain confidence in the outcome of the election, at least as to the election itself. I mean, certain kinds of allegations and accusations are unlikely to ever be resolved by these post-election methods, but at least a good number of them could be. And so what I have suggested from the inception is that the best way to gain confidence in it is to have a full manual recount that's observed and monitored. I mean, I was shocked by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision that decided monitoring no longer means monitoring. That we should at least impose on ourselves the same standards we impose on foreign nations before we will recognize the results of their elections. And that should also include a recanvass and an audit. An audit mostly is things like make sure that there weren't more votes than voters. Detroit's had that problem recurrently, unfortunately, and they've never resolved it, unfortunately, in the last several elections.
Let me just stop you briefly. So, I mean, when you say that argument can be made, I could make that argument myself if I chose to. Mm-hmm. But I'm asking if you personally are making that argument on your own behalf.
So yes. And I think it's important that argument be recognized. My own view is I believe that if the election laws had been uniformly enforced, that the result of the election would be in doubt.
Uniformly enforced in that if there was a national standard that was imposed on every state uniformly?
Or just if the states imposed their own, at least the standards they had a year ago, as to things like signature matches on absentee ballots. So I think if that had been strictly enforced, if they simply applied the same rules they apply when a candidate's trying to get on the ballot or an independent or an initiative or referendum is being proposed, on average in those contexts, they reject 20% or more of signatures as being not matching the signature on file. Here it appears I don't believe they really did any signature check. I think there was a lot of threatened litigation from Mark Elias and his group.
Sorry to keep interrupting, but
go ahead.
In Georgia, which is about to complete its certification process this afternoon, the entire Republican election administration regimen is claiming that there was a thorough signature certification process. So are they lying? Are they being deceitful in some way? Should we reject these Republicans or object to these Republicans when they're stating overtly that the signature verification processes were adhered to?
Yes, because they lied directly just last week. I mean, they lied to me, the representatives of them, because I've been in Georgia until just recently, the last 2 weeks. And they said explicitly that they would do a recanvass, an audit, and a recount, all three at the same time. He publicly said that. People can look it up on CBS. They recorded him saying it. And it's undisputed that a recanvass includes a independently observed signature match process. Then it came around to do the recanvass, and all of a sudden, none of the counties were allowing anybody to independently confirm that the signature matches took place. In fact, they weren't even doing an audit to make sure there weren't more votes than voters. So the Secretary of State just lied. He's neck deep in with the company there and also has a lot of other reasons. It's not in his interest to say that the elections that he was responsible for were not conducted correctly. And that's part of the problem. We have a system, we have a legal system that
also applies to the Republican Attorney General, the Republican governor, the Republican lieutenant governor, the Republican controlled Senate and and House, so both chambers of the legislature are controlled by Republicans, and that would apply to all those actors who have some degree of influence one way or another in kind of crafting election law?
Well, what I can say is that there was a lot of demand down there not to get into certain topics by the Republican establishment, and so you have a very influential.
All of whom are Trump supporters.
I'd put a little asterisk by that.
Well, all of whom are at least
nominally,
based on what they say, Trump supporters.
Yes, but I can tell you, most of the Republican establishment in Georgia is not big fans of Trump, and so there were a lot of things that were going on down there that were highly irregular. I can't get into a lot of them, but what I can tell you is the Secretary of State made public promises that there was going to be a recanvass. The United States Election Assistance Commission and the Election Integrity Project both say that should include a absentee ballot signature match process that's independently confirmed by monitors and observers. And there's no dispute that has not happened in any county. In fact, the Republicans asked before the election to be able to observe it, and that too was denied. So my view is, if I'm wrong, and if in fact the signature matches did occur, and that any independent observer looking at it would confirm the same, why are all of the states going to great length that are contested, going to great lengths to deny that one remedy? Just allow independent observers to double check that the signatures actually match. For whatever reason, now it looks like Wisconsin will do a version of that. They're a little bit different. They're about absentee application processes rather than signature matches. Will allow that to. I think we'll see an example of what a recount should look like in Wisconsin, and contrast that to what happened in Georgia. You're supposed to have this very independent. The reason for independent monitors. The other problem was the hand recount didn't have adequate monitors. They didn't allow them to see what ballots they were looking at.
Okay. And before we proceed further on that subject. So we've talked in the past, and I know that you've said that you won a lot of money in 2016 betting on the election outcome, correct?
Yes.
Now, did you bet on this election outcome?
I was more limited. I had a bet on predicted. I did, and I sold my bets on election night, so I made money this election cycle too. Not as much money as I made in 2016, but I had bets on the House and the Senate, a wide range of states and margins. And
did you have bet on the president? Any bets on the presidency?
Yes. So some of those bets cashed, some of them did not. Or well, I cashed out when Trump was trading high on election night because that was enough money for me to walk away from it. And there was still risk given where things were going. At least by 1, 2 in the morning, it was clear that it could swing back the other way, legitimately or illegitimately. I was concerned with. It doesn't look good when the big urban Democratic counties cash in all their votes late after everybody else has counted up their votes. I mean, that's how, historically at least, election fraud has taken place in the United States. And it's not a good indicator to create confidence in the election, in my view, to do it that way, whatever one thinks of it, whether one thinks that was just how it turned out by coincidence, or whether that was an intention to make sure they could counter the number of votes counted in the rest of the state.
Okay, so you don't at this moment have any outstanding financial interest in who becomes president on January 20th?
No, I do not, and I haven't for 2 weeks.
Okay, but before the election, you did.
Oh yes. And I went on with. I told everybody what all my picks were for House, Senate, right. White House, you name it.
Okay, well that's worth clarifying, I think, and also one more order of business is. I would assume that you watched or at least are aware of the press conference that took place yesterday with Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and the other members of the Trump campaign legal effort.
I am.
Did you happen to watch it, or
I watched bits and pieces of it? I was on a plane later on.
Okay, so I just want to ask you what your view is on various claims that were made. So I don't want to conflate necessarily your independent perspective with the quote unquote official perspective that's being purveyed by the Trump campaign officially. So Sidney Powell, who's one of the lead lawyers, said, quote, that the election is that this election outcome was determined, quote, by the massive influence of communist money through Venezuela, Cuba, and likely China in the interference of our elections here in the United States. So she's positing a foreign interference conspiracy of sorts. Does that align with your view?
That's not my view. No.
Okay. Rudy Giuliani said that there was a, quote, national conspiracy. That was his quote, his term, as to what he's alleging took place. And that conspiracy, by his lights, consists of, quote, a plan from a centralized place to execute these various acts of voter fraud. So he's asserting unabashedly a conspiracy by any reasonable definition. Is that aligned with your view?
I wouldn't go that far, no.
Okay, so you're not affirming what the official perspective is from the Trump campaign representatives.
No, my view is that is more.
Well, yeah, I just think that's worth getting on the record, because
sure.
When I'm inundated with these claims, most often they will cite the claims being put forward by Giuliani or Sidney Powell or Jenna Ellis, this other woman who's on the Trump legal team. So you're not ascribing to those views.
I'm not. I mean,
okay,
it's kind of, to a certain degree, I understand it. It's Russiagate, just on the right. And after 4 years of experiencing it, I can see why people might, respond.
As can I. I mean, I don't think I think it was a totally inevitable backlash.
Yes.
To what everybody was subjected to for 4 years by way of Russiagate. So I'm not doubting the inevitability, or I'm not disputing the inevitability of something like this happen in the event of an even remotely close election outcome. But that's a different matter from actually agreeing on the substance of what's being alleged.
Agreed. And I think there's legitimate issues that could be legitimately resolved, at least to increase confidence level. You're never going to get 100% of people with this kind of closeness of an election in our current political environment be satisfied. But I thought if we really did I was surprised that a signature match independently confirmed process did not take place. That increased my suspicion that something systemic had happened, but it may not be fraud. It just may be irregularity. It may be that for whatever reason, election officials chose in this election not to strictly enforce the signature match check. A lot of them were threatened with litigation over the spring and the summer by Mark Elias and his associated groups. And that may be why they didn't. But I think it created an enhanced risk that unlawful ballots were counted, and that the number of those ballots exceed the margin of victory in enough states that would dictate the Electoral College. And my own view has always been, and this goes back to Gore, I thought Gore should have done this, even though it would have been an uphill thing. We have a constitutional remedy of going to state delegations to the House, and that's a political branch remedy. I prefer that. I prefer that than Bush v. Gore, Supreme Court getting involved. I always thought that let the elected branches make their decision by the constitutional process when there's a significantly enough contested issues about who really won the Electoral College majority.
Okay, so just to underscore a point, though, for people watching, the arguments that you are raising are divergent from at least some of the central planks of the argument presented by the Trump campaign.
That's correct.
I want people to acknowledge that and not just say, oh, wait for the Kraken to be released by Sidney Powell.
Yes.
If the person that I have brought on, in good faith to make a case for this, is not even associating himself with those allegations. Okay. So a lot of to me, what's being alleged is a matter of inference or intuition or suspicion. And one thing I'll hear often is anomalies or irregularities. So first of all, it's not as though there have been that many presidential elections in U.S. history. So from election to election, you're going to expect outcomes that appear irregular or anomalous, right? For example, Trump's overperformance in the Rio Grande Valley, and even in other parts of even other areas with high Hispanic concentration in the population, would have seemed to many irregular or anomalous for a variety of different reasons. And yet, you can kind of ascertain patterns that make it explicable. And so when I hear just people saying irregularities, that makes me look askance, because when has there not been a, quote, irregularity from election cycle to election cycle? I mean, we have changes in population patterns, internal migration patterns between the states, demographic patterns. So that's always going to bring about irregularities or anomalies. And I think that sort of those terms are a little bit weasel wordy, because they can connote a measure of suspicion that I don't think has been established, or that they're not, oftentimes is not even attempted to be established. So they'll point to one thing that we pointed to is, or the crux of the suspicions tend to center on these urban areas, right? So Detroit, for instance. But I just double checked this morning, and in Detroit, Biden actually, at least as of the current count, will have received fewer total votes in the city of Detroit, not Wayne County, the city of Detroit, than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And Trump actually increased his total number of votes received from 2016 by 65%. Now, it's not a huge raw total, but he did increase the number of votes he received in the city of Detroit by 65%. So how does that square with these claims of irregularities and anomalies that are supposedly all skewed toward ensuring that Joe Biden wins the election?
I think I agree with you that the particular anomaly has varying degrees of persuasive evidentiary quality. That just because you have an irregularity or an anomaly doesn't necessarily make it a compelling argument. And I agree that the urban centers don't really form the best factual predicate for arguing ballot stuffing in this election. That's where my own view was, that this was just across the state. This wasn't located or concentrated in a certain area. I didn't like the fact.
The state of Michigan or nationwide?
Particularly in swing states, but I think in the end it's going to end up being nationwide. In other words, if it appears, at least preliminarily, that all the states that increase the amount of substantially signature mail-in balloting, which is most states, that a lot of them are showing extraordinarily low rates of rejection. And I'm curious as to why that is. And my suspicion is, if they had strictly enforced it, that enough ballots would have been thrown, that this would have, enough ballots would have been thrown out to change the election. But that's part one. But part two is, but I think that this would impact a whole bunch of states, even states that weren't competitive. And so this would cut against necessarily a conspiratorial theory. It suggests that just because election officials chose, for whatever reason, maybe under threat of litigation as the reason, just didn't strictly enforce that this cycle, maybe because of the pandemic, maybe the nature of it, they just wanted to make it as easy as possible to vote by mail.
Well, I don't think we even have to speculate. I mean, that was the stated rationale and why there was an increased encouragement of mail-in or absentee voting this cycle. I mean, if you go to I know that we're supposed to now believe that the Secretary of State of Georgia is a liar, but if you go to his official website, that under his jurisdiction, it encourages Georgians to vote by mail in the interest of diminishing their COVID-related risk. I mean, do you think that was an altogether unreasonable transition in every instance for that now to have been more encouraged than it had been in previous cycles?
Well, I'm not a fan of big absentee balloting, but my bigger concern was, while that would justify the reason why they encouraged absentee balloting, it's why did they decide not to really strictly enforce the signature match, which is the only method against absentee balloting fraud of that type. And now the concern,
in Georgia, they do claim that they strictly enforce the signature match. So we have competing claims as to whether the signature match protocol was sufficiently adhered to, because the Georgia Republican state officials all claim that it was rigorously enforced.
Yes, but at the same time, their absentee ballot rejection rate went down tenfold. So they have yet to explain how that happened. And if it's the case that they actually did the signature match check, why are they scared to allow a single county to have it independently confirmed, either before or after the election?
Well, are they scared, or are they abiding by election law, which my understanding per Georgia is that they were required to conduct this post-election audit or recount for a statewide general election. And they chose to now do it with the presidential election due to the national implications. And so to say that are they scared of permitting counties to do it, or are they just imposing, or they're just adhering to the law in conducting this post-election survey?
It's definitely not consistent with best practices, and it's not consistent with what they said publicly they would do. So I'll put it that way. So whatever their motivations may be, fear, something else, they said they were going to do a recanvassing, and under the United States Election Assistance Commission, which was formed after 2000 by Congress to come up with guidelines, best practice guidelines, and the Election Integrity Project, all said that recanvassing would include a checking of the absentee ballots, and their representatives told me that was going to happen when I was in Georgia. So they whatever reason none of the counties ended up doing it. They didn't put instructions in it, and when they were called on it, they said, "Don't worry, we'll fix it." And they never did. So,
okay, so wouldn't the prudent remedy in that case be to vote out the election officials who you're saying were insufficiently committed to making good on their pledges in terms of election administration, as opposed to negating the certified result of the popular vote outcome in Georgia and seating, either not seating the electors or seating now Republican electors, even though the Democrat won overall per the certified result? Like, wouldn't that be the more prudent recourse, as opposed to, I don't know, creating a constitutional crisis?
Well, I don't think you have to create the constitutional crisis.
You don't think it would be a constitutional crisis for multiple states to not seat electors in accordance with who won the popular vote in those states?
Well, that would be the next step if the evidence showed that, in fact, the signatures didn't match.
So what's the remedy in Georgia right now?
What the remedy is under the law is you file an election contest and you ask for my understanding is all the signature matches are digitized records in Georgia in all the counties. So, and you simply do an evidentiary check. You do a signature match check yourself, with independent observers, or you just produce those records and files and they check and they see were there enough signatures that did not match that exceed the margin of victory. Now, if that's the case, then the election is in doubt. Now, historically, the remedy has always been a revote, but we've never had this situation in the presidency. For the Constitution, it says instead of a revote, that goes to the House to decide who won. And so I think that remedy made sense. I thought why we did it at the beginning of the country always made sense, because it's not the old Congress, it's the new House. It's done by state delegation, and it's simply part of the power when you vote for your local congressman. One of the powers you're giving them is to decide a contested election. And I think that's a fair remedy. And then if people don't like what those members of Congress did, then they can vote them out. Now, I agree that voting people out is also a good remedy. It's just we actually have a legal system. The Election Assistance Commission went through all these protocols. Okay, how do we deal with these kind of issues? And they said, well, what you do is a recanvass. You independently observe it. You have people who have a partisan motivation, both there, Democrat, Republican, or however many candidates, to check the process, who can contest it. Then you put it in front of an election judge or a judge that decides an election contest in Georgia, for example. And if it turns out the election's in doubt, then they can't certify and it goes to the House. Nothing stops the House from saying
in doubt is sort of a vague concept, right? I guess you have to establish the parameters for what constitutes legitimate doubt. I mean, Trump said that the election outcome was in doubt the night of, or he said it even weeks or months before the election by casting doubt on the legitimacy wholesale of mail-in balloting. So what rises to the level of legitimate doubt? Is it just that the number of mismatched ballots could exceed the margin of victory? Is that the standard?
Yep, you pinned it. That's the legal standard.
Yeah. Okay. So, but you don't think this would generate a crisis?
Not to me, because I think we have this. To me, it's a wonderful constitutional process. So I know people would be upset about it, but let's go through and let's look at what the evidence actually shows first before throwing out any ballots.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt again, but if this remedy is so straightforward and obvious and constitutional, why is it that the Trump legal apparatus, which has a wide breadth of lawyers that could choose from, with a lot of experience in election law going back decades, why have they been so unsuccessful, for example, in bringing about this remedy in Georgia? Is it just because the establishment Republicans don't like Trump or something? Even though, I think it would be, in terms of their long-term political interests, they probably want to be as aligned as possible with Trump, given his vote totals did increase in Georgia and virtually everywhere, even if the margin trended Democratic.
I think you have two different things. One, technically, legally, you can only seek a contest of an election after certification occurs. So and you can still be within the Electoral College safe harbor, and because that's not until December 8th. So like in Bush v. Gore, they filed their election contest right after the Secretary of State certified, and that case ended up several weeks later up before the U.S. Supreme Court. But technically, that's where the timing would be for Georgia remedy. Now, I think I thought the Georgia election officials would do the smart thing, because my argument was, even if you think everything was hunky-dory in the campaign, well, prove it with independent satisfaction with it, which has transparency. Have a monitored hand recount, have a independently confirmed signature match check. This is not really brain surgery. The fact they went to great lengths, frankly, to mislead me and other people into saying they would do it and not do it leads me to distrust their office. And I think they're
what would you speculate is their motive for declining to carry out those measures which you advocate for?
I think they are embarrassed. Like, they're already, like, for example, in 3 counties, I think it ended up being 4 counties, they ended up finding votes they had failed to count. Well, to me,
over the course of the audit, right?
Exactly. And I was like, that to me was, those counties are doing their job. Well, instead, they punished those counties and fired the managers. The election, I was like, what message does that send? That doesn't send a message of, okay, hey, you know what? That sends a message of, if you find something that screwed up, keep it quiet. Not, hey, expose it, because the moment you expose it, you're fired. So I think the Secretary of State is mostly concerned with convincing the world that he ran a perfect election, and he cares a lot more about that than he does actually dealing with having a full, transparent process that everybody could have confidence in. That's my personal take. I can't mind read the guy, obviously. But
okay, so let me ask you this. So we have multiple states that are relatively close: Georgia, Arizona. I don't know if Michigan would be considered relatively close, given that the margin's over 100,000 votes. But Arizona and Georgia are the closest. Then there's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Those are generally the several that are in doubt, or not in doubt, or be contested, however you want to describe it. So the ideal constitutional remedy is for all 5 of those states to reject the popular vote outcome, at least as certified, and choose to do something that hasn't happened in history since at least 1876, depending on how you look at it. But 1876 was resolved by the 1877 compromise, which, if you weren't listening in history class, it's worth going and reading up on, refreshing your memory. But something on the order of that from 1876, it seems like would be the most recent precedent for resolving these issues along the lines of what you're envisioning. Is that correct?
So if one looks at the signatures or hand recounts and comes to the conclusion that they don't know who won, and then the remedy is to go to the House, and the House decides who won. And
1876 was the last time that occurred.
No, exactly. And only other time was, I think, was 1824. In both instances, the person that people think won the Electoral College actually was not declared the winner.
That's right. So let me give you another data point that sticks out to me, which is that, there are a few states which had essentially universal mail-in voting prior to 2020, prior to COVID. One of them is Utah, another is Hawaii. So in Utah, the number of raw votes cast in 2020 compared to 2016 went up by almost a staggering number. 31.5% more raw votes were cast in 2020 compared to 2016. And a similar shift was evident in Hawaii, which actually had one of the largest increases. 33.9% more votes were cast. And in Hawaii, that actually redounded to the benefit of Trump, or at least there was the largest shift to Trump of any state from 2016 to 2020, just based on what we know now in terms of whether you or not you affirm the legitimacy of the results. Based on the current data, Hawaii, amazingly, had the biggest shift to Trump of any state. And there was universal mail-in voting in Hawaii. You have other examples where, the Democratic governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, who ran for Senate and then lost, instituted an automatic mail-in voting protocol in Montana, and the Republicans overperformed in Montana. Bullock lost. They elected a Republican governor, and Trump won the state. So it seems like there's a bit of, I hate when people accuse me of cherry picking, but it seems like there's a little bit of arbitrariness in terms of what outcomes are being fixated on with respect to mail-in voting as supposedly inherently advantageous to Democrats, because I could give you countervailing data which suggests that's not the case. Hawaii and Utah and Montana being three examples. Is that sensible?
Oh, yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I just think that my view is that in the key swing states, and I think in other states where we're seeing unusually low absentee ballot rejection rates, that they did not do a real signature check. And if they had, there's more of those votes than the margin of victory in enough states that constitute the Electoral College majority. So that's my core premise. I don't go beyond that. So I don't allege a conspiracy. I don't allege that mail-in balloting inherently has this particular partisan effect. I mean, in fact, it used to be absentee balloting used to lean Republican. When the New York Times discussed this back in 2012, they voiced concern that the more absentee balloting happened, there would be more fraud and there would be more problems. And we saw some of that in the New York and New Jersey primaries in June, where the rejection rate was upwards of 20%. So I just find peculiar why suddenly the mail-in ballot rejection rate dropped off the cliff. I don't believe that by definition or by necessity that means fraud. It just means that our election officials did not do their job that may have dictated the outcome of the election.
Okay, so if there's a wide scale transition to mail-in voting, and when you don't need an excuse, right? I mean, so for example, in a variety of states where you previously needed an excuse or a reason to vote absentee, you no longer required that in order to gain your absentee ballot. So those regulations were relaxed. So there were fewer reasons why an absentee ballot might be rejected, given that relaxation of the standards governing an absentee ballot. So couldn't that be one plausible explanation for why the rate of rejection decreased?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where I thought the easiest way to do this is let's just have an independently confirmed signature check, and then we know in a transparent way. And, maybe my premise is wrong. And to be honest with you, I was kind of shocked when this wasn't happening. And when I was told originally it would happen, at least in Georgia, and then they went to great lengths, frankly, to buy time to not do it and then didn't do it. I'm just like, my strong suspicion is that there's something here, and it may just be systemic failure rather than corruption, but that a lot of people are going to great lengths not to have a simple, independent, transparent signature match check if there's nothing wrong with those signatures.
Okay, and I think a lot of people have a similar intuition that there's something potentially systematically corrupt about the outcome. And yet, there are some trends that are intelligible when you look nationwide. I know this sort of departs somewhat from your core premise, but supposedly the shift, and I tweeted this earlier today, and again, you run up against this epistemic divide where people aren't even willing to entertain the legitimacy of any of these data points. But the shift against Trump compared to 2016, I mean, in Michigan, was actually lesser than the shift against Trump in Kentucky. And yet we don't have this monomaniacal fixation on Kentucky. And I know that Kentucky was not a swing state, but if there was rampant fraud in Kentucky, that explains this shift, just as it allegedly does in Michigan and other states, then you could see why that smacks of arbitrariness and why that's just being disregarded. If it was truly a nationwide systematic problem, then shouldn't the scope of this be broadened out so it's not just solely focused on the several states that could determine the Electoral College outcome?
Yes, and I'm in favor of that across the board. It's as well as on the electronic side. So my friends on the left that I have worked with over the years, I would prefer, while I don't agree with the various conspiracy theories that are out there, I strongly prefer an old school manual system for ballots. I don't know why we're sticking computers and software in the middle of this process. It's going to invite skepticism. There's going to always be a group of people that doubt the outcome when there's a computer in the processing in the middle. I don't think it ends up
paper
saving
ballot backups don't dispel that skepticism.
They should, but I'll give one example. They don't in terms of public confidence, in my experience, is part one. It's definitely an improvement over just having a computer count the vote. But the second part of that is it interrupts the chain of custody of ballots. So one of the problems that may pop up in Georgia, for example, is, I mean, like normally you have a strict chain of custody with a ballot, kind of like what you would have with evidence for police. So somebody prints it, they print a certain number, they have a watermark, it gets sent to the local county, they keep track of it. They say, okay, we mailed out this number, we handed out this number, we have this number back, we didn't get certain numbers back, and the rest is still here. The problem with the paper ballot computerized system is it could print as many ballots as it wants. So like, it will not surprise me if at some point people are going to say that some of the, when they were testing the ballots, they usually test them a day or two before the actual election day. They print out something that looks exactly like the same as a ballot. Now, you should be able to track that with serial code numbers, but it depends on how they do it. If they don't spoil those ballots, you have this interruption in the chain of custody. So you have a bunch of ballots sitting there that were test ballots that might end up intermixed with other ballots if you're not strictly being real clean with chain of custody. It's one of the problems that's created that's unique to a digital system that we would not have if they did testing protocols really right, then that risk can be substantially reduced. But it's just a new risk that's introduced by computers that personally, I just like the old school, go in, fill it out, stick it in there. That's what you get. And I think ordinary people would have much more confidence in that process than they would any system that involves computers and machines.
Yeah, I recall during the Brexit vote in 2016, you could actually watch the counting rooms where it was just people like taking pieces of paper out of a box, counting them and tabulating.
I think that's great. I think it's old school democracy. I would have been arguing with some of my friends on the left is like, you don't have to agree with whatever conspiracy theories being out there. This is a great opportunity to build a left-right alliance on areas where they agree historically, or at least now agree. Election reform can take place. There's no reason not to have a more transparent process, a more open process, and a more old school process. I mean, UK and Canada, both of them do old school paper ballots. I don't know why we can't. At a minimum, it'll increase confidence level. We can see from this election, whatever one thinks of the allegations, there's going to be a portion of people believe it just because we have these computer software election companies. You know how they get those contracts. It's not like the third grade civics version of how they make a law, like used to see on the public broadcast. It's not exactly that way. That's maybe some of the issues in Georgia. Who's connected to who, wanting to make sure those election computers aren't questioned or contested. It creates bad incentives, in my view. I just strongly prefer old school ways of doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable. Although I would want to do a deeper dive on how Utahns, is that how you pronounce residents of Utah?
You're asking the wrong guy.
Yeah. How residents of Utah, for example, feel about their all-mail voting system. It seems like they're reasonably confident in it, and those are pieces of paper, which obviously have to go through a verification process. So I think there's something to that just in terms of sheer public perception. But the problem with this is that having this fulsome discussion in the context of a hotly contested election aftermath is always going to distort the contours of that debate. So if it could be done 2 years before an election, say, then maybe people could approach the issue a little bit more rationally. So I just don't. So now, I mean, if your ultimate aim right now is not to just on a more wide scale level improve confidence in elections, but to ensure that Donald Trump is the president on January 20th at 12 noon Eastern time, then that's obviously going to have a warping effect on how good faith of a discussion can be had on these terms.
Yes. I mean, the upside is that crises tend to create the opportunity for reform and the public attention necessary to a problem. But the downside is it tends to have, particularly in our modern tribal partisan era, lead to such. I've been disappointed that Michael McDonald and other people on the left who have called for a range of election law reforms have been critical of aspects of these things. I'm like, this is a great cross-partisan opportunity, but I don't think that will develop until after Inauguration Day either way. But I'm hopeful that some aspect of this leads to reform over time. My own personal professional interest in this is not limited to Trump. I saw it as a great chance for us to really reaffirm these methods that we've been trying to put in place for 20 years to improve confidence and transparency, and was honestly just deeply disappointed that it didn't happen. I'm still hopeful that it maybe will happen. I mean, I think with Wisconsin's recount, I think will increase confidence in the outcome there, because people are seeing, wow, that's a real, you look at the ballot.
Will it though? Because I mean, the Trump campaign
Maybe not
could
for
have
the
paid for
hardcore.
a statewide recount, and they chose only to pay for recounts in 2 counties, which skew Democratic. So I don't know if that really bakes in a whole lot of added confidence.
Not that part of it, but the part of them witnessing what a good recount can look like, where they're saying, okay, there's people getting.
I mean, that was done in 2016 in Wisconsin, right? Or at least partially.
Yeah. It just wasn't televised as much, and I think there was less attention because it sort of faded out with Jill Stein. But like, I was in favor of those. I thought that was a good thing. I thought, anything that we can do to improve confidence and transparency in our election law procedures and election access, and that we little d democratize it. Like, I'm a fan of these election contest laws that allow any voter to sue. I think that's good. I mean, I think there's this institutional desire in the media and elsewhere to kind of have a certain gated institutional narrative that I don't think is good for long-term confidence in democracy. That's where, like, screaming for Trump to concede early. Like, well, that even if Trump conceded, there's going to be a large number of his audience that believes that this election was stolen. So why not do everything possible to particularly the rules that were already designed to do this, to at least give as much confidence as you could. You're not going to cure it, but you could, at least people like me would have a lot more confidence in the outcome if I could just see these protocols and procedures utilized, when that's what these procedures were designed for the last 2 decades.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, on principle, I don't have any objection to that either. But especially if you deal at all with this subject online, it's always at 5-alarm fire hysteria mode as to how the election was rigged or corrupted. There was some kind of conspiracy. You have Dominion, all this stuff. If everybody was just operating on the relatively narrow premise that you've set forth, then maybe we could have a more instructive discussion. But that just seems to be totally impossible unless you and I have a one-on-one discussion over YouTube like this.
Exactly. The only other thing I would recommend is these tech companies come up with new names. We started off the election with a tech company called Shadow, and then we finished one with with
the Iowa caucus app.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, come on, it's a little bit over the top. It's like a badly written screenplay, but it is what it is.
And even Diebold in 2004 was a little creepy.
Oh, it was. And that was, like, people forget, this originally started off as a left-leaning criticism. What I would call I represented Ralph Nader in a lot of those cases, in the sort of Naderite world of, look at these big companies, look at their connections, look at their correlations. And I thought it was very unhealthy. I was like, no, I don't want some big company having this kind of access to the way the vote is tabulated. And even if it's all innocent on the up and up, it just doesn't smell right, and it will never gain confidence of the ordinary voter.
No, I mean, I recall that. I even, I wasn't quite old enough to be like professionally engaged with it in 2004, but I remember the 2004 controversies, and it was people like John Lewis, Jim Clyburn, Ed Markey, who got on the floor of the Senate, or of the House, excuse me, and refused to, objected to the certification of the Ohio electors on a whole variety of grounds, some of which were claims of suppression, others outright fraud. So, I mean, we have precedent for this, and a lot of the basis of their claims at least stemmed in part from these convoluted statistical extrapolations about counties in Ohio. So there are a lot of recurring themes in U.S. politics if you're around long enough.
This is not new. This is very old terrain, and I got the mass pressure for Trump to fold right away, but I thought that was counterproductive, because the media still doesn't get when they start saying, listen to us, don't listen to them, don't listen to them, don't listen to them. They're increasing lack of confidence. This is not how you gain confidence with open, transparent election procedures that the world can watch from their home computer, which is a realistic possibility in the modern age. I mean, for example, in Georgia, when they did the deal with Dominion. They said one of the great things here is that all the ballots will be scanned so that we can upload them for the whole world to do a manual recount if there's ever a contested election. So I recommended that to them when I was down there. I was like, let people look at this themselves. You're the confidence level in this. This is a great opportunity to show how transparent recounts can be. And it's one of the, in my view, one of the better arguments for any involvement of technology in this process. And they said they would, and then they chose not to. I mean, their behavior has just been not the behavior that inspires confidence in their decision making. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Although, I mean, just to play devil's advocate, I don't remember people shouting about the media being premature in declaring Trump the winner in 2016 because we hadn't gone through the full certification process yet, or the full extent of any post-election litigation hadn't been completed yet. So, I mean, I think some of that is sort of just self-interested partisan gamesmanship.
I think it's always inherent. You know, when your guy loses, the other side cheated. When your guy wins, it was clean and completely legit. And history suggests the truth lies somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Okay, so I mean, I think this was a useful conversation. I don't have a whole lot more to say. I guess just one final note is a frustration of mine is that there's a lot of interesting material in this election if you're not inhibited by the immediate presumption that it's like 100% fake. And yet we don't even it seems like for a lot of at least the online commentary world, we haven't even been able to broach that topic yet, because immediately you get, slammed with how stupid are you for falling for MSM propaganda and believing that Trump may have won Michigan, or Biden may have won Michigan, right? So, and not all of the findings here are disadvantageous in the long term for Republicans. I mean, I mentioned this not long ago, but 100% of the California results are in yet, but you could go look into city level data for like Los Angeles County, which amazingly trended Republican overall. And in cities that are 95% Hispanic, like Commerce, California, which I happen to find, because they're actually, for whatever reason, Los Angeles County is a little bit better in terms of collating some of the results by city. Biden's margin dropped by, last I checked, around a third compared to Hillary. Not margin, vote total dropped by around a third compared to Hillary in 2016, and Trump's increased by almost the same amount. Now, that's really interesting. I mean, we would want to get to the bottom of what long-term trends that portends, right? But as of now, it's just an impossibility to even do it, because you get these somewhat nihilistic people saying that I just don't believe any of it. Right. And I think, I guess so the question I would put to you, so going beyond the core claim that you're making, I mean, when you look at that Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell press conference yesterday, I mean, does that advance the interests that you're trying to advance?
I don't think it does. I think it undermines the president's interests. I think it because a transparent account would help him, in my view. And I think it undermines the country's interest, and I don't think it's productive. And I haven't been overly constantly critical, but I've been quietly critical that this was an unproductive path. Once you start throwing in, if it sounds like Russiagate, it's a bad idea. That's been my advice to everybody.
Yeah, if the ghost of Hugo Chavez is somehow involved, then
yes,
I don't know, maybe not the right road to go down.
And that's why I have the book by Richard Gott. I got his name right. On Hugo Chavez, I recommended people because it's a much more balanced version of Hugo Chavez. When they're using these spook types, I mean, when Sidney Powell was bringing out what a guy that is smacked of the same type of people that sold WMDs in Iraq, these ex-connected generals that are clearly part of a world we don't want to be a part of. The other book behind me is Taylor Panama, great book by John Le Carre, great movie too. The version of that, Our Man in Havana by Graham Greene, also made into a movie. The spook world lives on lies. I mean, you could predict what Chris Steele's nonsense was going to be and where it came from. And people should have the same skepticism when they're trying to fit what felt to me like a disinformation campaign. Trump has, in my view, legitimate grievances and legitimate issues. Those are being completely swamped out by these claims that I don't think will hold up under any evidentiary test.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. Any concluding thoughts? Anything I didn't touch on that is worth noting that you can think of?
No, just I think that that whatever people think about this election, looking past it, I think we should look at ways that we can come across party and ideological lines to make sure our elections are better conducted, more open, more transparent in the future. And I think that we can help achieve that. And if we use this as an opportunity to do so, it will have been worthwhile. If we
let me ask you one thing. Sorry. One objection that occurs to me that you'll often hear from Democrats when they're trying to counter Republican claims of fraud is that, the Republican legislatures in states like Pennsylvania refuse to allow counting of absentee ballots ahead of time, so that they had to do these quote dumps at night that now, if you look at charts being posted by Trump and others, seem potentially anomalous or irregular, right? So whereas Florida was able to count the votes ahead of time before Election Day. What do you make of that objection?
Oh, I think there's there's a lot of other legitimate criticisms of all these legislatures. I think that's also why you're seeing a desire when you're asking towards the top, why is there this, if there's problems with the election, why are Republican officials not coming to expose it or deal with it? It's because a lot of these problems came from their own decisions in the spring and the summer. They created this nightmare. It was a bipartisan created nightmare. And because there's a lot of big money interests that profit from this in the election world, I mean, these are $100 million plus contracts. There's no, it's kind of like a mini version of the national security state. There's nobody on either side's interest to really, it was like when I was representing Ralph Nader. My biggest problem was Republican lawyers and Republican secretaries of state and Republican judges, even more than the Democrats. They both got together to make sure little Ralph wasn't on the ballot. It tells you a lot about how the system really operates. They care more about protecting itself than they care if either party wins, frankly.
Yeah, and when you look at the details of these election administration laws and procedures, the extent to which the two-party duopoly is kind of built in legally to the basic administration of these laws gives you insight into how intractable that two-party system is, just at every level of government. It's not just some figment that a bunch of people just choose to entrench. It's actually codified in law at so many different levels, and it's easy to be just oblivious to that if you don't spend the time reading the arcane election codes that actually govern this process.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I thought this was a useful discussion. Now I would at least request that my trolls not accuse me of sweeping this under the rug or ignoring it or what have you, because I just spent almost an hour discussing it with somebody who's at least rational and sane, which is a little bit difficult to come by if you're just swimming through the fever swamps of a lot of the online commentary on this issue. So, all right. Thank you, Robert. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Take care.